Welcome to Wrestling and Everything Coast to Coast with your host, Buddy Sotello, and this week, our special guest host, Mike Lano. Mike, would you like to introduce this evening's guest?
All right. Well, we're going to be discussing one of the most important things, more important than anything going on in the House of Windsor in England or stimulus checks or whoever, whatever Cuomo is doing at this point, and that is wrestling's roots. Tim Corvin has produced probably the ultimate book and is a respected historian, but we were learning before going on air. I had to sneak off and leave for a second. It sounds like Tim is involved as a wrestler or something. So Tim Corvin, the book is called Pioneers of Pro Wrestling, 1860 to 1899, available from Archway Publishing. You know, and Tim, I met you, was it the 2018 Cauliflower Alley?
I think so, yeah. There's a few of them that I attended, and I think I was there in 15 and then 18 and 19, yeah.
Well, this book is the definitive book. I know Steve Yohe was going crazy over it and told me I had to read it and start promoting it. So I've been promoting it for a couple of years because it's been out for a few years, but we'll get into where we'll let Tim plug where you can get it, hopefully through him, so he gets all the loot, which he deserves, because I know a ton of research went into the history. I had to write this down, so I'm reading from my notes. It goes into the history of the origins of not just pro wrestling, but obviously MMA. Now, MMA, you know, various forms of it, but the wrestling portion dates back to ancient Greece and pancration, and then on up to, well, we can ask him. I've always been led to believe that not choreographed, but predetermined finishes for wrestling matches started around 1880s in France, kind of before the carny at shows, etc., the carnival days where wrestlers' lingo came. It wasn't invented for wrestling; it was invented for the carnival workers, and denoting who was a mark and who was in on what was going on. The book features profiles on over 30 mat legends. So we're talking some of the greats: Farmer Burns, obviously Fred Beal, so many others, and we'll get into that. Like, I want to ask you, Sorikichi Matsuda was any relation to Hiro Matsuda, who, of course, not just a world NWA junior champion in the Sam Munchnick era, but trained a number of guys, great talent and not so great talent like Hogan and Lex Luger. But anyway, Tim, for starters, it sounds like you were saying that you were moving around. So have you been wrestling, or were you wrestling on Tennessee Indies? Tell us all about that.
Yeah, well, I was talked into getting into the ring a couple of times. Yeah, I did do some. I was an athlete in my youth, and I did some wrestling in high school, so I kind of knew some of the basic amateur stuff. But yeah, working some of the indies, there were times where somebody didn't show up, and they got to have somebody in there. And in most cases, because I used to do I did all kinds of work in the business, and with some of the promotions, I did like ringside photography work and stuff like that. So if it was some place where the fans were, would recognize me, it's just somebody would give me a mask and say, "Here, man, just put this on and get out there and just get bumped around for a few minutes and get out of there. We just needed."
What were the names? What were the names of some of the characters that you played under the mask?
Oh, I had this one particular mask, and it had like this spiral design on it. And I got to talking with the guys, creative, and we decided with that spiral design, it was kind of hypnotic. And since it was Lucha Libre type of mask, so...
No, it's El Psicodelico, Mil Mascaras' second of three brothers. It was El
Right,
Psicodelico.
I recognize that, yeah. I don't know if it was Dos Caras or who it was, but... Anyway, we came up with this gimmick of being a Lucha Libre wrestler called El Hypnotista. And I'd go in there and, I had a little stopwatch thing that I'd wave and hypnotize my opponents, and I'd make them dance with the referee and do crazy. I was kind of the comedy relief of the shows, So sometimes I'd go in there and do my El Hypnotista character, And,
so, and what was the Hypnotista's finisher?
I didn't even get that far,
you were always part of the enhancement talent. So
right. So anyway, I would usually just try to give the other guys a push, who were really in there trying to get somewhere with it. I was just doing a job for them, and among many other things. But I did. I was in the performing arts business for a number of years, and I pursued an acting career. I performed in probably 20 or 30 stage productions and things like that. So it was actually my acting is kind of what was first being put to use. I was a heel manager for a while, and then I went face, and then I started doing ring announcing and commentary and stuff like that. And
you're a face manager.
Yes.
You're a face manager. Well,
Yeah.
how did that work out? I found like I've only been a face manager twice in my career, and those were two of the longest 10 minutes of my life.
Right. Well, that's the thing is, I kind of thought at first, like, oh, well, this will be easy. I won't have to really stretch. I want to, play heel gimmick or anything like that. I can kind of be closer to myself. But I'll tell you, it took a lot of acting to be a face too sometimes, because there were nights where I just did not feel like getting out there and smiling and waving and getting my picture taken with the kids and all that stuff. There were times where I just wasn't into it, but I had to put on that smile and get
What was your face manager character? What were you called?
Well, I had a name that went way back many years ago, Captain Cloud. In fact, I do video.
Yeah, I knew you were going to be a captain of something. I just looked at you and I said, if he was going to be a manager of something, he's going to be captain something. So.
Yeah, I did. The Captain Cloud was an old nickname that I'd had going back to the early '80s, I think. So I just took that, and I had kind of a bowler hat and a striped vesting, kind of a riverboat captain type of look, and so I just ran with that.
Somebody took the name, the managerial name of Samuel Clemens or something like that, which was Mark Twain's, Mark Twain's real name, and just used that because some of the funniest things are a friend of mine for the last 40 years who managed in Philly and Jersey. Now he runs a promotion in Wisconsin. Carmine Desperado was working as UB Marks. He was a big fan of UB Blake, the entertainer, but UB Marks is kind of funny in a wrestling.
Mark, yeah, smart Mark. I get it.
Let's go back even further. Buddy usually asks these questions. Where did you grow up? Was it like here? Because you're not that far from me in Yucca Valley, California. But where did you grow up? How did you start following wrestling? And what wrestling were you watching? So let's go into your earliest roots.
Okay, yeah. Mid to late 1960s, when I was probably 6, 7, 8 years old, right around there. I was in Southern California. I was born and raised in San Bernardino, and the LA promotion would come to San Bernardino every week. But unfortunately for me, I was a preacher's son, and we had church on Wednesday evenings. That's when the promotion did the shows in San Bernardino on Wednesday evenings. So had church commitments and never could see their live shows there. But
what was the venue called? Because I was one of the ringside photographers for the program. LA was my primary, LaBelle, and prior to that, my home base. But what was the venue in San Bernardino is what we called it.
Yeah, the San Bernardino Arena, but yeah, they. I did in my high school years in the mid 70s. I had a couple of occasions where I snuck off and went into and saw some Friday night Olympic Auditorium shows. So I did get to the Olympic on a few occasions when I had to be coy and sneaky about it because there's no way my father would have allowed me to leave town, So
was that mid 70s when you might have gone to the Olympic?
I'd say probably like 77, 78 around there.
So that was the Guerrero Piper, and then
right. In fact, that was one of the main events was a Guerrero Piper match, and then I believe there was another one that I attended where it was those two in a chain match where they had a chain tied between the two of them, So yeah, some good times though for sure. So yeah, I grew up following the Los Angeles promotion, and then there was a time when I was about 12 or 13 years old for a period of a couple of years where we moved up to the Monterey Bay area, and I was exposed to the Shire San Francisco promotion. Got to see some of that on TV. And then right out of high school, around 79, 80, I moved to Colorado, and Denver was part of the AWA circuit, so I got to see a lot of Gagne's AWA. And then there was also a Blanchard promotion from San Antonio, Texas, called Southwest Championship Wrestling. They'd come up and wrestle once a month in Colorado Springs, where I was living. So I got to see that's probably the promotion that I saw the most live events with. And so yeah, fortunately, I was old enough where I had the opportunity to see some of the old territorial promotions.
Now, who were some of the stars in Joe Blanchard's promotion? Was Gino Hernandez there yet, or his son Tully, Tully was? Yeah,
Tully was the top heel, And I remember seeing a brutal Indian death strap match that he had with Wahoo McDaniel. And Killer Tim Brooks was there, and they had Haystacks Calhoun came in for a while, and James J. Dillon was the top babyface, and then he turned heel and joined forces with General Skandor Akbar and his team of monsters. And so, yeah, look, they had some fantastic talent, you know, Killer Carl Krupp and Gypsy Joe. Yeah, there's a lot of great talent that I remember seeing from that promotion.
Was that the Gypsy Joe that ended up doing the major hardcore stuff in Tennessee and then Japan?
I think so. Yeah, I'm not positive, but I do remember a character there called Gypsy Joe. So.
And who do you know who else might have been in Skandar Akbar's army? Was Missing Link in it then, or
Devastation Incorporated? You're talking about?
Incorporated, yeah. Well, that's what he used when he was in Watts Mid South, and then
UW when he was in Global, when he did his Global stuff. But was he working with the Link and the One Man Gang back then? And
no, I remember he had this big Japanese guy, big huge guy, looked like a big giant Buddha, and he won something.
Shuhai, maybe.
I don't remember his name, but I remember that
Japanese guy. Anyway, that was the convict. That was the guy that was.
Yeah, that was more later.
I think it might have been not Tojo Yamamoto, but it might have been Killer Khan under a different name, working for.
Could have been. I do remember that he won some big match for Akbar, and Akbar paid him off by giving him this giant, large, raw fish, and he ate it. Just chewed into it right there.
Yeah, guys do not do that anymore. They don't have the crazy, outrageous.
Right. Well, now you know, Moondog, the first Moondog, Lonnie Main used to do that. He would swallow and eat live goldfish. He and Abby, would eat, depending on the territory, would eat. Raw fish because they already liked it because of all their trips to Japan anyway. So,
right. I do remember seeing Lonnie and Moondog in Shire's promotion when I was up in the Monterey area. And I remember during this one interview, he had this Alpo dog food since he was Moondog, and he was eating this raw dog food while he was being interviewed.
Yeah, so that's something they haven't brought back.
The Shire days with Moondog. So was Fuji there? Because I remember. I think it was Tuesday nights was John Swinsky, was Roy Shire's policeman, his sort of enforcer, hooker, shooter. He was a former NWA junior champ, just like we were talking about. And he promoted San Jose at the Civic and, major cards there. But Monterey was not as frequent. It wasn't weekly. Was it monthly? Do you remember?
I don't even know if they wrestled any live shows there. I just know that their show was broadcast there on TV, so that's where I would watch it from, And but yeah, I was just talking the other day with somebody about this woman model that they had. I forget what they called her, but
Miss Wrestling.
Miss Wrestling, yeah, exactly. And
that was my second home base, and she would stand next to the board, which would have all the squash matches for the night, and. When somebody won, she'd put like a star or a little sticker.
Exactly. That's what we were. And I was telling somebody about how that shot that they had, it was always like half the camera was her extended breast. You'd see the left side of the camera would show the little marquee where she's putting the stars next to the name. The other half, the right side half is all of her breast there on camera.
They know how to get people's attention.
Very quickly, there were 3 Miss Wrestlings, and one of them was the actress Adrienne Barbeau, who then, of course...
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either.
She was in a million things, but she was in the Swamp Thing, the movie, the first one, the real thing in the 80s. And the very last one, and that's why the gimmick ended.
She was in Maude, wasn't she? The TV show Maude.
Yeah, that was
Adrienne Barbeau.
She played B. Arthur's daughter, but the very last of the 3 Miss Wrestlings... Allegedly, although he told me this himself, Roy had an affair with, and his wife Dorothy found out about it, and that's when he started hiding the purses, the gross from the wrestling shows, or whatever he took as his gross, and started burying it in the backyard because she threatened to, to sue him and leave him and take all his money. So he stopped putting it in the bank. He put it in have you heard the story, Tim? I'm sure Russ may not have heard this either, but he started burying it in the backyard, and after a while, things settled down, and he went and started to collect it. But the money, the cash, had started to deteriorate. And so he asked some of the boys, and I think Frankie Kane, later known as the Great Mephisto, told him, or it might have been Terry Garvin, who told him, Jesus, you better go to Washington, D.C. to the Treasury, because there's several 100,000, and see if they can't exchange some of this. And a majority of it had deteriorated so badly they couldn't give him new bills. Some they did, but so all of this over.
He needed Bitcoin. Bitcoin back then.
Only in wrestling, but he was wealthy enough. He had one of the largest. It's up in Sebastopol, in like around Napa, Sonoma area. But Sebastopol had one of the largest horse and cattle ranches, and he and his wife Dorothy would show their animals at the Grand National at the Cow Palace every year. And until she became infirm, she was still doing that after his death. Because he used to come to my, I worked for him. That was my secondary home base. And Alan Bolte, who did the programs, Russ knows, started listing me as the official photographer. The program was called Action Wrestling, started in '73, because I was like flying up, even before I could drive quite yet, to San Francisco to shoot all of Roy's big shows, even though my main home base was L.A. LaBelle at the Olympic and KCOP, the TV studio. So a lot of mutual history we can talk about at another point, because you're here to talk about.
Speaking of, I'd like to find out more about your book about wrestling history,
sure.
Especially because it goes back even farther than Mike Lano does, and that's saying something. Maybe about 5 or 6 years before you started covering wrestling, his book kicks in the 1800s, right?
That brings us to how did you get into the formative years of MMA and wrestling, because that's so interesting, and there's few guys that can really take that time, like a Steve Yohe or a J. Michael Kenyon, who can really go and do that, because it's research and labor intensive. This is a real labor of love that you put together in the book. Again, we're talking to Tim Corvin, the author of Pioneers of Pro Wrestling, 1860 to 1899. It's an amazing look at that cover. I was just because I haven't been able to find it since we moved. It's in one of our boxes, but I remember, like, what was it? The mid to late 80s, there was like trading cards of some of these guys. And like many of them were, they were like lumberjacks, guys that built the railroads, miners and stuff. So Tim, tell us how you got into that aspect of it. What piqued in the history of the bit?
Being a wrestling fan all my life and having worked in the business off and on in the business and so forth, and I've always been into history, so I looked into the history of professional wrestling and everything that I ever saw on it, all the books and documentaries or anything, it always went back to like the early 1900s, the carnival days. And several years ago, I was online doing something. It was totally unrelated, but I came upon some article about some big events that took place in the mid 1880s in some area of the country, and in there somewhere it mentioned this heavyweight championship wrestling match between William Muldoon and somebody, a real notorious heavyweight championship wrestling match. And when I saw this, and this was like in the early 1880s, I thought, wait a minute, I thought professional wrestling only went back to the early 1900s from all the information that I ever had. But once I saw that it was going on, but in the 1800s, then I started doing a bunch of research. And unfortunately, now back then, this was something I put together, I think around 2014. And all of my research was on the internet. But now since then, of course, they've got all kinds of, old newspaper sites and things like that. I could go into much more detail now than I could then. But yeah, I just started, I researched those names, and then I came up with a bunch of other names of opponents that they wrestled against, and just every name of a wrestler that I could find, anybody who wrestled professionally in the 1800s, I researched their name and found all the information I could. Some I found a ton of information on, and some I found next to nothing on, But so it was just a project that I did kind of for as a hobby, really. But I would spend a few hours a night almost every night over a period of a few months just gathering information, and then. And after, I don't know how many months of that, but once I'd gathered all this information, all that I could find, then I spent another few months organizing it all and putting it all together and, making it comprehensive, and coherent. So
I have my first question is, because I love mass wrestlers, you being one of them yourself. Who is the oldest mass wrestler that you were able to find?
The first recorded masked wrestler Theo Bauer, who was a Frenchman, and I believe it was in France. He wrestled under a mask. I've got that information in my book here, exactly when it happened. But he wore a mask, and that was a big mystery. People were trying to find out who he was and so forth like that. But yeah, that goes back. I think in France. I could look it up here, but it is in my book. What was
the name of his character? That's
the. If you give me a second here, I could probably find it here.
This was way before the Masked Marvel, or later the Zebra Kid, George Bolas, people like that.
Right. I've got a listing here of events. Let's see here. Wrestling. Okay, 1873. Wow. Wrestling's first masked wrestler enters the ring in Paris, known simply as the Masked Wrestler. He would soon come to America without the mask and wrestle under his real name, Theobald Bauer. So there you go, wow. 1873. Paris.
The Masked Wrestler. Must have stayed up all night to come up with that.
Right.
But that's great.
Put a bag over his head.
Yeah, but no one had ever done it before, so that's the unique aspect of it. Do you know what the reason for was? He was it just a promotional gimmick, or
probably, yeah, just who is it, and I wouldn't, I'm sure it was just something to lure, something that somebody created to be mysterious and that would draw people in. So,
but on the professional aspect, how were they charging marks? What was the setting, and how would they get remunerated or make money? To your knowledge, if you know.
Well, in the early days of professional wrestling, where wrestlers are actually making money wrestling, everything that they made was on bets. Everything, it was all betting, and there was no guarantees, no gates or anything like that, so everything was done on betting, which was, as you mentioned earlier, about the first worked matches and stuff like that. Yeah, there was, later 1800s, people were beginning to question the legitimacy of some of the matches because there was money on, bet money on it and stuff like that. There was one particular, one of the early collar and elbow champions, last name was McMahon, as a matter of fact, John McMahon, and he got shot after a wrestling match that he lost because people thought that he threw the match, on purpose, and people lost money, and he lived, but yes, he got shot in the arm by an irate fan who lost money on a match that they bet on him. So,
wow. So, to your knowledge, when did wrestling start having finishing moves instead of just trying to pin guys?
I think that had to have been more in the 20th century. I haven't found anything during that era that I covered where they had worked finishes.
Okay, so
as if there was a worked finish, some of these bouts went 5 hours, way longer than that.
Right.
Why? What was the point of that? Was it to create some believability? Why go so long? Obviously no undercard with matches like that.
Right. Yeah. No, that was the Greco-Roman style. There was three particular popular styles of wrestling in the later 1800s. In the Civil War camps, they wrestled what's known as collar and elbow, and you noticed. Some of those aspects exist to this day. Usually the first thing wrestlers do when they lock up is they grab each other's collar and elbow, So, and that the whole idea was to throw the other one onto the ground, and they wore harnesses. And so you had the collar and elbow, and then you had the Greco-Roman, which was all waist up and no striking. It was just all holds and, all waist up stuff, Greco-Roman. Those were the matches that would go on for hours at a time. And then the third one, which is kind of became the mainstay, what we know in professional wrestling and the MMA today. Back then it was called catch as catch can, which it's a freestyle where strikes and upper body, lower body, legs can be used and all that stuff. And so catch meant grab. So catch as catch can meant to grab anywhere that you can. And so, yeah, that's the freestyle that we know today that the wrestling and MMA is based on, that we see today. So those are the three main styles. But, yeah, the Greco-Roman, which is all grabbing on the waist up, yeah, those matches sometimes would go on for hours. And some of the matches that I researched, it would talk about how after a few hours or after so many hours, they would have to call the match because the lease on the dance hall that they rented out had gone, expired at 2 a.m. or something like that. So they had to end the match and clear out of there.
Garden curfew, 11 p.m. Started on curfew.
And I heard of one match where they had to drive the cars up to the ring so that they'd have the headlights from the cars.
Like, right, that sounds interesting. Yeah, I'm sure that would have been early 1900s stuff. But yeah,
because
I worked a show one time. I'll tell you an interesting story. I was doing a video, ringside video for this promotion, and in the middle of a match, the lights went out. We were in a armory, place pitch black. Probably 400 or 500 fans there. Middle of a match, suddenly everything's just pitch black. And since I was at ringside with my camera, I flipped on the light on my camera. And that kept the show going. And then when I turned the lights back on, it took like 5 minutes for it to slowly get back to full power again, So basically, my camera saved the show by the only light that was available when they had this blackout in the middle of a match. So,
as long as you're talking about that, Tim, so we're going to just jump forward to your Tennessee days just for a little bit, then go back to, of course, your book, Pioneers of Pro Wrestling, 1860 to 1899. Corvin, Corvin. So, Tim, what were some of these indies, and were some well-known folks in Tennessee that you might have worked with, like Nelson Royal or anybody like that? Or
I started off in the mid-'90s after I moved out there. I had some connections in Atlanta, Georgia. So I started off working the indies around the Atlanta area. And, yeah, I had the opportunity to meet and get to know the Iron Sheik and Tommy Wildfire Rich. And I briefly met Rick Rude not long before he died. And so a lot of the other guys, Abdullah the Butcher, worked a few shows with him. And so got to know a lot of the people around the Atlanta area. I heard a lot of good things about Mr. Wrestling, who recently died. I had the opportunity to meet him in the Cauliflower Alley. I told him, I said, dude, people still to this day talk high, good things about you in Atlanta. He left his mark there. And so then from there, I eventually settled into East Tennessee and started working promotions up there and up around the Atlanta, Knoxville area. And so, yeah, we would have some, some of the old Smoky Mountain guys there, Dirty White Boy and Jimmy Golden, some of those kind of guys, and Dr. Pritchard, Tom Pritchard, and got to work with him once. And so we had Jake the Snake Roberts in one time, which is a real sad story. He was at a low point there. And so I have that video, but I refuse to release it. Anyway, so yeah, just we would always try to get some named people periodically to appear, and some of them, if they couldn't wrestle, then they'd at least show up and sign autographs and stuff like that. Rock and Roll Express, they're still active out there, to my knowledge. So
yeah, no, they're still in NWA.
Right. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. We're working all around there, and so I was kind of in and out of the business and working all different aspects of it, behind the scenes and in the ring and just where I was needed. So
if I can ask, what do you feel was like the difference in the type of wrestling that you watched in the South versus the type of wrestling you watched in Los Angeles?
You know what? Los Angeles had a lot of the Lucha Libre influence. And so, a lot of that quick action and high flying in the mask and the colorful costumes and stuff like that. In the Eastern promotions that I worked at out there in Tennessee and Georgia, it was more of a brawling style, a la the Fabulous Freebirds. I could see a lot of people had the Freebird influence, So it was more of a just a what do you
brawling.
Call it? Yeah, just a pure brawling style, basically, And they would get into it. A lot of times they'd get into it with the chairs and all that kind of stuff, and some of the promotions that I worked with were trying to be ECW, and these guys would just, beat the hell out of each other. I said, guys, to have a bloody match like that once in a while is a specialty, great, but you don't, when you do it every night, then it gets to the point where everybody's going to expect it in every match, And so, anyway, but yeah, they were just doing what they thought was, would draw money or whatever, So, so yeah, I enjoyed it though. I really enjoyed as a fan watching it and then working in the business as well. So,
do you even watch any of today's stuff? And if you do, what do you watch?
No, very, very rarely. If I just happen to be browsing through the TV, which I rarely watch any TV anyway. So yeah, I really don't know what's going on out there these days. I know that last time I checked, with the COVID thing, they were doing matches without in empty arenas,
But
And
who started that? The very first empty arena, at least of modern times, if not the very first one, was Lawler, Terry Funk, and Memphis.
that's right. That's right. I remember
1981.
seeing all the pictures in the magazine about that.
Yeah, and I've talked to both of them about it, and they kind of wish people would bring that up. I would have done that night one for Vince's promotion and say, this is how we're doing it, but it does have a history and blah blah blah. And that was so entertaining versus the sterile environment. I was going to ask you, and then I'll defer to both of you guys, what guys might have from the 1800s might have translated to current. But one quote I got, because I had to look it up online, Ernest Robert, two-time Greco heavyweight champion, had there was newsreel footage of him in a 1901 match against August Faust at the very first Madison Square Garden, which the last event there was Bruno Bull Raymond in, I think it was 66, and then it took him a year and a half, 2 years to construct and open the brand new one. But so that was like the opening footage for WWF's Coliseum home videos, the introductory thing. That's probably the first bit of any kind of footage of wrestling, or is there any footage prior to 1901?
Not that I'm aware of. No, that's it. And in fact, I mentioned that in my book as well, because I do cover Ernest Robert's. He was a champion in the late 1890s. I believe he defeated. Was it Muldoon or Farmer Burns? Yeah, he one of those two that he won the championship from. But no, as far as wrestlers back then, who I think would go over well today. One of the characters that I got a kick out of was the original Strangler Lewis. Now, most people know of the Strangler Lewis, who was part of the Gold Dust Trio in the earlier 1900s, but there was a journalist who recognized, who saw a resemblance between the two. So the second Strangler Lewis was named after the first one. One's name was Ed, and the other was Evan, and I believe it was Evan Lewis was the wrestler that I covered in the 1800s. But he was like a heel. And he was known for his dirty tactics, and he had this rear naked chokehold, and that he nearly killed some of his opponents with. But he was one of those guys that after he'd win his matches, the fans would boo him and throw tomatoes and stuff at him, and he'd just stand there and take it all in while gracefully taking his bows, And so he caused some near riots at times and stuff like that. So yeah, when I learned about him, I thought, he's one guy who would go over well in today's wrestling world.
Why aren't more people aware of this? And that's the importance of your book. Why are people not more aware and talking about, hey, this goes, because for the last 30, 40 years, many of us, I've had conversations with Nick Bockwinkel and Lou Thez himself. We all thought that wrestling with finishes predetermined, etc., may or may not have been fully choreographed. We're like 1880s France, but you've proven that it goes back 30 years, maybe even, beyond that, beyond 1860, or at least using that as a starting point. And that's important to know for, particularly the Iowa Museum, the Thez Tragus Museum there, that focuses both on amateur and pro. And that's this is big, important stuff.
Right. Well, that's what motivated me to put it out as a book to begin with, because I realized that, it's an era that has not been covered before, in wrestling history, and that's why when I read about all this stuff, I said, well, I'd read plenty of wrestling history articles that goes back to the early 1900s, but this preceding that I didn't even know existed, and I'm sure that most people don't know that it exists. In fact, somebody was telling me they were a part of the Wrestling Hall of Fame down there in Texas. I think it's in San Antonio. And they wanted to do some kind of a pioneers tribute or something like that, but nobody knew much about it until my book came out. So, somebody told me about that recently, about how my book helped them out down in that. I hadn't been down there yet, but
there's two. The weird thing is Mike Chapman, who's like the god of amateur wrestling, as an expert. He started in I guess it was about 1995 or something, the Iowa. The pro wrestling. So that's the Thez Tragus one.
Right.
But about 20 years ago, a guy up in upstate New York started the Wrestling Hall of Fame. And about 3 years ago, he sold it to Ken Mantell's half-brother, Johnny Mantell, and that's the Fort Worth, Texas one.
Okay.
So there's still two. And the weird thing was the guy, and whose name escapes me now, who Paul something or other, who started the Buffalo Museum and then was having financial difficulties, sold it to the wrestler, famous former wrestler, worked for Fritz von Erich and World Class in Dallas. But that Fort Worth one 3 years ago, now they have heat, and the guy in Buffalo wants to restart his own thing, and he stole it only in wrestling, right?
Right. Yeah, I have been to the one in Iowa, the Des Tragos Hall of Fame. I've been there in the museum. Really nice, so I've been out there a couple times in the last few years, and that's a really nice place. I enjoy that.
Yeah, that's real super duper professional.
Yeah.
And you must be well received. You must sell your books, bring them there. People are going to buy them, I'm sure.
I do. Okay, what I enjoy the most about that is meeting a lot of the other wrestling authors and historians, and their end at CAC, and some of them, I when I was doing my research, I'd learned about who a lot of these people were. So for me, it was almost as much of a thrill meeting those guys as it was meeting a lot of the old legends that I grew up watching on TV. So but yeah, so I've enjoyed Scott Teal and Dan Murphy and those guys. So many of them have been good to me and supplied me with good info when I needed it and things like that. So it's been really enjoyable to get to know those guys and seeing them at those gatherings.
Now, I haven't heard of a follow-up. This book is several years old, but still in high demand. So we're going to let you plug away. Have you thought of a new project, maybe wrestling at the turn of the century at 1900? And
well, people have asked me that too. They said, now that you've covered that era, will you cover the next era, the early 1900s? And I said, well, that's been done. A lot of people have already covered that era. What I have done is I've continued to gather more information. And I've been saying all along that I may eventually, I'd like to, if it's affordable, if it's feasible, I'd like to put out a volume 2 or some kind of an expanded version of this one, because I have gathered a lot more information since I put this one out from within the same era. So
good. We have a scoop then that you'll be doing another book exclusively here on Wrestling and Everything Coast to Coast. You heard it first. Tim Corvin is going to be making another book. So
I'd like to.
Well, we'll be here to promote it when you do. I have maybe a deeper question that I always like to ask wrestling historians, and it's a basic one, which is, why is learning about wrestling history important?
Well, I guess, and again, for me, I've always just been interested in history in general, but I think it's, as a pastime, as a form of entertainment, and as an athletic deal, it's just, I don't know, if you're into that thing, it is important, I think, to know. It gives you a better idea of today's product if you know the origins of it. And it's something else another reason why I was motivated to put this book out was because it seems like all the other popular sports, whether it's baseball, football, basketball, whatever, the story of their origins has been told. There's been books put out about it and documentaries and stuff like that. We know about the history of baseball and how it began and so forth. But wrestling is something that it's never been covered before. Where did professional wrestling in America? How did it originate and get going? So that was kind of my driving motivation for researching and finding all this stuff.
And the cool thing is there are still great towns, states for wrestling history that refuse to buy into Vince's brainwashing and rewriting of history, which is really repugnant. It's really despicable to try to alter that or to demean, say, Georgia Championship Wrestling as wrestling, or Mid-Atlantic, the Crockett promotion. We just lost Jim Crockett Jr. About a little over a week ago as wrestling. No, that S was way better than anything that's come out of. I mean, the greatest bout ever in Madison Square Garden from a pro wrestling standpoint was not WWF product at all. It was Dynamite Kid Tiger Mask 82, and people still talk. It was better than even Bruno's best matches, and he had I covered a lot at Madison Square Garden, some historic, cool stuff. Don Leo Jonathan, greatest big man in the business, at least the TV era, against Bruno, and Bruno Spiris Arion, just some amazing stuff. So that's of note, and that's why wrestling history. Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, San Francisco to a large extent, anywhere in Tennessee, the Northeast, they refuse to be brainwashed. Florida, most parts of Florida, they're way into their history, and obviously Japan and Mexico. The world's oldest promotion, 83 years old, CMLL, EMLL, Paco Alonso, the Saul Luderoth promotion. That's older than any American. WWF can say all that crap they want, but the Mexico Lucha promotion is the oldest in the world.
And would you say, Tim, that as the history of wrestling goes, so goes the history of the United States as well? There's a certain portion of how the United States is reflected in how wrestling itself has evolved from what it was to what it is.
Yeah, and wrestling has always played into what's going on in the modern culture, whether it's the wars. Of course, the most successful early heels were those portraying the Russians shortly after World War II, and Germans, and then the Russians during the Cold War. Right. So it's always been a reflection of what's going on around us. And I know we were talking about the wrestling style in the South and stuff like that. I was just seeing something recently. I don't know if it was Jim Cornette or who it was who was talking about the popular hillbilly characters that McMahon has always had in his World Wrestling Federation promotion, and basically he was saying that McMahon has all these hillbilly characters because he likes to rip on Southerners. He's always had that riff with them regarding popular wrestling and so forth. So anyway, but yeah, it's interesting when you reflect back on that history. How wrestling has always been kind of a reflection of popular society, I guess.
They call it a microcosm of American society. That's what wrestling is. And the funny thing was, if you cornered Killer Kowalski, Walt Kowalski, he would tell you everything in life is a work. That comes from wrestling. You don't believe the governor of New York or Trump when they say, it's like wrestle speak, double talk.
Yep.
Yeah. So,
go ahead, buddy. I was going
to say, going back to the 1800s and kind of falling on that same level, what was it that made people into heels or faces, or were there really not? It was just who you were betting on, and the heel was whoever you didn't bet on. So you were just rooting against or were there things that were actually storylines that kept going from match to match back then?
No, there were wrestlers that did tour together, and they wrestled all over America, and made a lot of money working with each other and stuff like that. But no, they trying to think of this one particular story where, and again, it was this McMahon character who I was telling you about before. In the old West days, there was a friend of his in Virginia City, Nevada, who lost a bunch of money to this guy who was like the local champion wrestler. So they brought in McMahon as like a ringer, and who just was sitting at the saloon where this guy happened to hang out and started talking about how, I've thought about wrestling or whatever, and then wrestled the guy, and all these bets came out, and McMahon intentionally lost the first couple. It was like best 3 out of 5, and so he built up all the betting and stuff like that, and then of course beat the guy at the end and got his friend's money back and things like that, So I think a lot of it depended on possibly the occupations of the wrestlers. There's a lot of railroad men, and as Lano has said here earlier, up in the north you had the lumberjacks. But a lot of railroad guys, a lot of miners. And as I said back then, the money was either made or lost by way of betting. So there's that old saying, "Back to the coal mines for you." And back then, that was meant in a literal sense, man. The guy lost all his money wrestling. He had to go back and work in the coal mines some more to make some more money to go bet again.
Right.
So it was during that time, particular when pro wrestling in America first started really evolving, was during the Industrial Revolution. So there's a lot of new technology and stuff like that going on as well. So it was an interesting era for sure. You learn a lot about that, where we've come since then, and that particular era through the wrestling shows.
Tim, I've got to go, but I want to make sure you plug your book when I leave. But I just want to ask you this, because in remembering that aspect of the book, some of the guys being railroad workers, there was a lot of talk now, making reparations. There was a lot of racism against Chinese Americans who were the ones that really threw their bodies into helping make America's railroads, particularly on the West Coast. Was there any aspect of Asian Americans that were involved in when railroad folks were having some of these matches?
The one Japanese wrestler that I covered that was known in America back then, the only one was Matsuda, Hirusha Matsuda. I think you mentioned him earlier, and he would seemed like he got beat more than he won, but the guys that he was wrestling against were like the tops in the business, and I heard, and then somebody else debunked it, that it wasn't him, but it was somebody else. But I heard that he tried to introduce professional wrestling in Japan back then, and they just weren't quite ready for it yet. So that was 1880s, I guess, 1870s or 1880s. But yeah, there was this one particular guy, Matsuda was his last name. Was
he related at all, perhaps, because it's not a real common Japanese last name, to Hiro Matsuda, or no?
I think that's who it is. Let me look here in my table.
Hiro Matsuda was later on, and he wrestled in the 60s and 70s. And then
this guy's name was Sorakishi, Sorakichi, Matsuda.
Well, maybe one of our viewers can go through that. And when wrestling did start in Japan, there were some women tours that preceded the guys tours in the 50s. And then I think it was 56, 57 was when Ricky Dozan started, and he initially brought guys like the Sharp Brothers, Ben and Mike and Thez, and then later Dick Beyer, the Destroyer, and Fred Blassie to get going. But that was when it first was happening. But the weird thing was, prior to that, the only professional wrestling that was coming in, at least in the 50s, were late 40s, early to mid 50s, was women, like Mae Weston, Johnny Mae Young, and Dottie Downs, and folks like that.
Yeah.
So very cool. And also, if you do, which you really should, a second volume of this, maybe you could. I'm not sure when wrestling stole carnival speak or carny.
I was going to actually ask a little bit about that later. So yeah, no, I'm interested to hear your answer to the same question.
And the reason they would use that language is just like the circus carnival workers, was so none of the marks understood what they were talking about. So
that's right.
Not just calling matches like Drizop Kizik, drop kick, but they could communicate upcoming spots or have a whole conversation, which I've seen guys do, rapid fire. And the weird thing is, there are a lot of different levels. If you ask Jim Cornette about his carny versus West Coast or Northeast carny, there are little fluctuations and variations in that wrestle speak that evolved. It came from carnival days, but then wrestling really latched onto it. And, it would be like people having a Southern drawl versus Northeastern having a haughty way of speaking, and things being slightly altered, versus carny in Japan, carny in Mexico, French-Canadian carny.
Yeah. One of the interesting stories that I cover regarding the carny days was we talked before about who was the first masked wrestler, and one of the other wrestlers that I cover who's credited as the first costumed wrestler, the first one who actually came to the ring in the arena wearing costumes, was William Muldoon, who, good-looking guy, bodybuilder. He appeared in some Broadway productions playing a gladiator, and so when he would do his carnival shows, he would wear that gladiator outfit that he wore on Broadway, and so therefore he's credited as the first costumed wrestler.
Wow, that's great. Well, Mike, I know you have to leave, but Tim, I'd like to keep you on the show. So,
my mistake, Kim.
We'll see you again real soon, Mike. Thanks for being on this week.
Going again.
Oh yeah, when it's safe, and I'll email you tomorrow anyway.
Okay, great. I appreciate it, Mike.
So now it's just us, which is fine. We still have a few more minutes. If you have a few more minutes,
sure.
Yeah, one of the things that we were talking about before the show started was the odd thing that we have in common is that we both were part of California Championship Wrestling, but completely different bookends. Yours was your California Championship Wrestling was what, in the 70s or 80s or
mid 80s, yeah,
mid 80s, and mine was in 2006, the mid 2000s, mid early 2000s. So Tell me a little bit about your California Championship Wrestling.
Well, the promoter was obviously an outsider. I think his name was Barry. He was like a rock and roll DJ type of guy. And it was quite obvious that he did not know the business at all. And rather than accentuating the positives and
the owner of the other California Championship Wrestling didn't know that much about wrestling at all either. So they had that in common also.
I think Barry sold it to a guy named Palumbo, who was like a former boxer. And then he called it All-Star California Championship Wrestling. But I just know that when I was involved with them, they were doing shows at the San Bernardino Arena. And what had happened is they were just getting started. They'd filled the arena with a bunch of warehouse workers from their sponsor, who was a clothing manufacturing company. And but these were not wrestling fans. They had no idea how to react to what was going on. And I got there, myself and a friend of mine, we were both young actors, always looking for a break, and we saw these TV cameras. It was a UHF station out of Orange County. I think it was KDOC, but they were, taping, and it was 3 hours. They did 3 one-hour shows during that night, so it was like all night of wrestling. But when I got there and I saw those cameras, and me being a young actor, I said, I'm going to divert the attention. I'm going to get these cameras' attention here. I'll make them forget about the wrestlers and focus on me. So I got out there, and I was right there at ringside, and I was jumping up and down and shouting and doing all that I could to, get the attention. The faces would come, and I would, pat them on the back and yay, cheer for them, and then the heels, and I'm booing and hissing them, and just trying to draw attention to the cameras. And what had happened is, because we got there a little late, we missed like the first half hour of the first show. Afterwards, when everybody was clearing out of there, the promoter and one of the wrestlers, Big Bill Anderson, who I'm still friends with to this day, they approached me and they were saying, hey, man, you guys were great. And we didn't know what they were talking about, but they explained to us how these were not wrestling fans that they had filled the arena with. And before we showed up, they were dead. They didn't know how to react. And then when me and my friend showed up, we basically taught them how to be wrestling fans. Nice. So we basically inadvertently charged up the fans. So with that, they invited us. They said, if you'll come to our TV tapings, we will let you in for free, and you can have all the free sodas you want out of the souvenir shop there. The
free sodas. That's the winner right there.
Right. And I thought, hey, man, as a young actor, I've worked worse gigs than that. I said, sure. And so we started coming to their TV tapings. They'd let us in, give us free sodas, and we'd get out there and charge the fans up, So that was my first job in the business.
Did that lead to your being a manager there, or?
No, that's all I did with them. And then that was like in the mid-'80s. And then it was like 10 years later when I moved back east and had some friends in the Atlanta area. And then that's how I got to know a friend of a friend was involved in the business, and so we attended their show. And then I got to talking to the promoter and the guy who ran it, and he looked at me and says, you're a pretty good athletic, good sized guy here. Have you ever wrestled before? I said, well, a little bit when I was in high school. I grew up an athlete playing football and stuff like that. But as we got to talking, and I told him about how I had this acting background and how I'd performed in a lot of stage productions, and they were like, well, we need a manager. And so that was where I kind of got my foot in the door, was because of my acting background. And then from there, I just kind of took off and I started doing anything that they needed me to do, And the last few years that I was in the business, I was basically running the live shows. I was the technical director or program manager. They gave me different titles, but I was basically on top of everything, making sure that we ran a good, smooth show, So,
nice.
So, yeah.
So who was your favorite talent that you managed?
Oh. My favorite talent that I managed. Oh, there was a couple of guys. Since I was wrestling, since my manager name was Captain Cloud, they put me together with these two huge guys, and we were called the Cloud Colossal.
Huh.
They were both enormous guys, and considering the size that they were pretty athletic too. They were pretty agile, and one of them had done some training down in Texas. He said that he'd done a little bit of training with one time the school that he was at. Stone Cold Steve Austin came in and gave him some tips and stuff like that. So yeah, I could definitely see that they had some good training, because they could move good for big guys. So yeah, I had a lot of fun with those guys. And
they never went anywhere. They weren't famous. They didn't wind up being famous.
No, they worked the local indies out there, and they were known around that area, around East Tennessee. But no, I don't think I ever worked with any really known legends as far as managing them goes. I did work with them on the same shows and stuff like that, and I know this one particular occasion, we had the Iron Sheik, and he was really uptight because he had to go do something for WWF, and he had to make sure that he was on his plane that was leaving at a certain time, so he could only be there for the opening match, and then he had to leave right away. But he needed somebody to give him a ride to the airport, and who's going to take him? And as it was, he was wrestling against the guy who I was managing, and I had nothing else to do after that first match. So I said, yeah, I'll be done after that first match. Sure, I'll take you. And it was, he was so uptight. He was so worried he was going to miss his plane, but it was quite an adventure taking him to the airport. And then a few years back, it was several years after the fact, but I met up with him again at the Iowa Hall of Fame, the Thez Tragos Hall of Fame, and they were honoring him there. And he didn't remember me, but because it'd been so many years ago. But I had the opportunity to meet his wife and family and his daughter.
Oh, that's great.
So yeah, we reflected on that a little bit about the time when we worked together, and I gave him a ride to the airport. So,
do you ever want to do a book that goes even further back than the 1800s?
That would be interesting, but I don't know what as my book kind of covers in the beginning, the first known real organized wrestling matches was like 1830 in France, and so it doesn't.
But like maybe to the very beginning, like the Greco-Roman, like the actual early Olympics and the start of recorded combat,
Right. Yeah, I know the first Olympic 1896 Greco-Roman was represented in that the first Olympics in 1896. But so yeah, and I know sometime several years ago they were talking about taking wrestling out of the Olympics, and I don't know.
I know, and a lot of people didn't like that idea.
Right.
When you've got ballroom dancing,
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. You get rid of ballroom dancing first before you get rid of wrestling, because that was, when you talk about ancient Greece, wrestling was. In fact, they had like about 5 or 6 different wrestling events back in sports like pancrase. Going in the ancient, Greek Olympics and so forth. And I don't think we'd all have the stomach to watch real hardcore pancrase stuff. Weren't you allowed to bite people in apparently from that, the very earliest stages of wrestling, everything was legal back then. Right. And you just basically had people clawing each other to death, for a medal or the garland wreath. So,
right.
But yeah, no, it's all very fascinating. I'm really glad that you took the time with us to share, what your book with us, and for our fans, if they were interested in getting a hold of the book, how could they do so?
I used to offer on Facebook, I have a group page called Captain Cloud Productions, and I have that at the very top there. And it used to be you could order it directly from me through my PayPal account, and then I would send them an autographed copy. Something here got messed up on that. I don't know, because I haven't got those kinks ironed out yet. I don't know, something happened with the account. So now I'm just suggesting that people go to my publisher's website, which is archwaypublishing.com. And then you can just type it in the search engine. I think if you just type in the first word, Pioneers, it'll take you to my book, Pioneers of Professional Wrestling. And also I have on YouTube, I've put together a little promotional commercial for it there, where I had a lot of the legends that I met up with at CAC give little plugs, So James J. Dillon and Diamond Dallas Page and Terry Funk and a lot of those guys holding my book up and saying, you got to get this book, So
nice.
Yeah, that's on YouTube. I think, again, if you just type in Pioneers of Professional Wrestling, it'll take you to that little promo link for it. So that gives you a little insight on what all's in it.
And if our fans wanted to get in touch with you, how would they do so?
Again, I'm on Facebook, either by my name, Tim Corvin, or like I said, I have a group page there, Captain Cloud Productions, and or they could email me at tmcorvin@aol.com. It's my name without the I in Tim, so just tmcorvin@aol.com. But yeah, I'm out there. That's the only social media that I'm really involved with is Facebook. But yeah, I am on Facebook, and I do have my group page there. In fact, I'll make sure to post a link to this feed here on my.
That'd be great. Yeah, we definitely should be hooked up together through Facebook. really enjoyed tonight's session with you.
I did too.
Very informative. Lots of great information. I hope our fans really enjoyed everything that you had to add to it. And we'd love to have you back again as a guest, especially if you get ready to write another book. We'd love to help promote it.
That sounds great. I'd love to be back on again. I really enjoyed it. I've always enjoyed Mike's conversations and company when I've met up with him over the years. And so we've been talking about doing this for a long time, so I'm glad we finally got a chance to get it done.
That's great. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll see everyone again next week. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Good
Take
night.
care.